I threw a 60th birthday party. My wife and my son handed me an eviction note and divorce papers. The business, the house, everything was gone. My son sneered, "You're a pathetic old failure." They burst into laughter. I signed and walked out. But a week later, 32 desperate calls. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. 60 years on this earth, and I thought I'd seen everything. I was wrong. The backyard looked perfect that Saturday afternoon in September. Chloe had insisted on throwing me this party, saying I deserved to celebrate reaching my 60th birthday in style. White tablecloths covered the rented tables, twinkling lights hung from the oak tree I'd planted when Paul was born 32 years ago, and the smell of barbecue filled the warm air. Neighbors, old friends, even some clients from the construction business I'd built from nothing were there, laughing and enjoying themselves. I should have known something was off when I caught Chloe and Paul whispering in the kitchen earlier that morning, their heads bent together over some papers. When I walked in, they quickly shoved everything into a manila envelope. "Just party planning stuff, honey," Chloe had said, flashing me that smile that used to make my heart race 25 years ago when we first met. Now I realize it was the same smile a snake shows right before it strikes. The first hour of the party went smoothly. My old friend Jim from the construction crew raised a toast to the hardest working man in the county, and everyone laughed when Mrs. Peterson from next door told the story about me fixing her roof during that terrible storm last winter, refusing to take a penny for it. But I kept noticing Paul checking his phone and Chloe kept glancing at her watch. There was an energy between them, an excitement that felt wrong somehow, like they were waiting for something. It happened right after I blew out the candles on my chocolate cake, the one Chloe had ordered from that fancy bakery downtown instead of making herself like she used to do. I should have seen that as a sign too. "Dad, before we serve the cake, Chloe and I have something special for you," Paul announced, his voice carrying across the yard. Everyone turned to look at us, smiling faces expecting some heartwarming father-son moment. My chest swelled with pride. Maybe my boy had finally grown up, finally appreciated everything I'd done for him. The years of working 16-hour days to pay for his college, the business I'd built that would someday be his, the sacrifices I'd made so he could have opportunities I never had. Paul reached into that manila envelope and my world came crashing down. "Happy birthday, old man," he said, his voice suddenly cold as winter steel. "Here's your eviction notice. You've got 30 days to get out of the house." The paper felt heavy in my hands, heavier than any tool I'd ever lifted. My eyes struggled to focus on the legal language, but the meaning was clear. I was being thrown out of the home I'd lived in for 23 years, the house I'd bought with money earned from my own sweat and blood. "What is this?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sudden silence that had fallen over the party. Chloe stepped forward, and there was no warmth in her eyes anymore, no trace of the woman who used to curl up next to me on Sunday mornings, who used to say I was her hero. "And here are the divorce papers," she said, pulling out another thick stack of documents. "I've been planning this for 8 months, Robert. I'm done pretending to be married to a man who bores me to tears." The guests were staring now, some with their mouths hanging open, others looking away in embarrassment. I felt like I was drowning, struggling to breathe as the reality hit me. "The business, too," Paul added, and I swear there was glee in his voice. "I've been the one actually running things for the past 2 years anyway. You've just been dead weight, Dad. A relic who doesn't understand how things work anymore." I looked down at the papers in my shaking hands. Transfer of business ownership, divorce settlement, eviction notice, my entire life. Everything I'd built, everything I'd worked for reduced to legal documents with my signature forged at the bottom. "How?" The word came out as a croak. "Power of attorney," Chloe said, examining her manicured nails like we were discussing the weather. "You signed it 3 years ago when you had that bout with pneumonia, remember? You were so grateful that I was taking care of the paperwork while you recovered. So trusting." The memory hit me like a physical blow. I'd been sick, really sick, and Chloe had been so attentive, so caring. She'd brought me documents to sign, told me they were just routine business papers and insurance forms. I'd signed them without reading, my head foggy with fever and medication. "You planned this," I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. Paul laughed, actually laughed. "Of course we did. Did you really think we were going to let you hold us back forever? You're 60 years old, Dad. You're a failure, a washed-up old man who peaked 20 years ago." The cruelty in his voice, the casual way he dismissed everything I'd sacrificed for him, cut deeper than any blade. This was my son. The boy I'd taught to ride a bike, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose college tuition I'd paid even when it meant eating ramen noodles for dinner. Around us, the party guests were starting to murmur among themselves. Some were gathering their things, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama unfolding before them. Others were staring with the kind of morbid fascination people have when watching a car accident. "The house will be sold," Chloe continued, her voice businesslike and efficient. "The proceeds will be split between Paul and me. You'll get nothing. The business is already transferred into Paul's name. You have no claim to any of it." I looked at the papers again, trying to make sense of the legal jargon through the fog of shock and betrayal. Everything was there, documented and notarized. The house I'd bought with my first big construction contract. The business I'd built customer by customer, working 18-hour days in the Texas heat. The savings account I'd been contributing to for 40 years. Gone. All of it. Gone. Sign them, Paul demanded, holding out a pen. Make this easy on everyone. My hand trembled as I took the pen. What choice did I have? Fight it in court with what money? Challenge legal documents I'd apparently already authorized? I was 60 years old, standing in my own backyard, surrounded by people who'd just watched my family destroy me. Jim stepped forward, his weathered face hard with anger. This ain't right, Robert. You don't have to sign nothing. But I was already signing, my signature shaky but recognizable. What was the point in fighting? They'd outmaneuvered me completely, used my own trust and love against me. I'd lost before I even knew there was a battle. There, I said, dropping the pen onto the table next to my untouched birthday cake. Are you happy now? Chloe and Paul exchanged a look, and I saw something pass between them. Satisfaction, victory. They'd gotten exactly what they wanted. Oh, we're thrilled, Paul said, his smile sharp as broken glass. Finally, the dead weight is cut loose. The guests were leaving now, most of them avoiding eye contact, as they hurried past me toward the front gate. I stood there in my own backyard, legally no longer my backyard, watching my 60th birthday party dissolve into whispers and uncomfortable silences. Within an hour, everyone was gone except for Chloe, Paul, and me. The decorations that had looked so festive that morning now seemed like mockery, like props in some cruel theater production. You need to pack your things and be out by the end of the month, Chloe said, already heading toward the house. I'm changing the locks tomorrow morning. I watched them walk away together, my wife and my son, their heads bent close as they discussed something I couldn't hear, probably planning how to spend the money they'd stolen from me, or maybe just savoring their complete victory. The setting sun cast long shadows across the yard, and I realized I was completely alone for the first time in my adult life. No family, no home, no business, no future. At 60 years old, I had nothing but the clothes on my back and the devastating knowledge that the two people I'd loved most in this world had been planning my destruction for months. As I stood there in the gathering darkness, one thought echoed in my mind. I'd trusted them with everything, and they'd taken it all. The Sunset Motel wasn't the kind of place I'd ever imagined myself living. $49 a night, weekly rates available, and a neon sign that flickered between vacancy and no vacancy, depending on which letters were working that day. The carpet in room 12 was a brown shag that had probably been installed sometime in the 1970s, and it smelled like cigarettes and broken dreams, but it was what I could afford with the $327 in my checking account. Everything else had been frozen pending the divorce proceedings, though Chloe's lawyer had made it clear that wouldn't matter much. The power of attorney I'd signed gave her access to everything, and she'd been methodical about cleaning out every account we'd shared. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring at my phone. No calls, no messages. The silence was deafening. For 40 years, that phone had been my lifeline to clients, suppliers, employees. Now it was just a piece of plastic that reminded me how alone I was. The worst part wasn't the money, though. It was the memories flooding back, all the signs I'd missed, all the moments that suddenly made terrible sense. Like 6 months ago, when Chloe had insisted on taking over the bookkeeping for the business. "You work so hard, honey," she'd said, running her fingers through my hair the way she used to when we were young. "Let me handle the paperwork so you can focus on what you do best." I'd been grateful, touched even, that she wanted to help after years of complaining that I was always working. Now I knew she'd been positioning herself to understand every asset, every account, every legal vulnerability I had. Or the way Paul had started showing up at job sites more frequently in the past year, not to work, but to talk to the crew, to the clients, to present himself as the face of the company. "Dad's getting older," I'd overheard him tell Mrs. Martinez when we were remodeling her kitchen. "I'm taking over more of the day-to-day operations." I'd been proud of his initiative, fool that I was. The air conditioning unit rattled and wheezed, fighting a losing battle against the Texas heat. I'd worked construction in this heat for decades, but now it felt oppressive, suffocating. Everything felt different when you had nowhere else to go. I thought about calling Jim, my old foreman. He'd been at the party, had seen the whole humiliating spectacle, but what would I say? "Hey Jim, want to hire a 60-year-old man with no references since his own family stole his business?" The construction world was small in our county. Word would spread fast that Robert Hendricks was finished. My stomach growled, reminding me I hadn't eaten since the birthday cake I'd never actually tasted. The motel vending machine offered stale sandwiches for $4.50 each. I fed crumpled bills into the slot and watched a sad-looking turkey sandwich tumble into the tray. As I unwrapped the cellophane, another memory surfaced. Paul 3 years ago bringing me a stack of insurance papers to sign after my pneumonia diagnosis. I'd been so weak, barely able to hold a pen, my head foggy from the medication. "Just routine stuff, Dad," he'd said, his voice gentle and concerned. Health insurance updates, business liability coverage, that sort of thing. Chloe researched all of it while you were sick. She just needs your signature to make it official. I'd signed everything without reading it, grateful to have a wife and son who cared enough to handle the complicated paperwork while I recovered. The irony was bitter enough to choke on. They'd used my illness, my vulnerability, as the perfect opportunity to steal everything I'd worked for. The sandwich tasted like cardboard, but I forced myself to eat it. I needed to keep my strength up, though for what, I wasn't sure. At 60, starting over seemed impossible. Who would hire me? What skills did I have beyond swinging a hammer and reading blueprints? My phone buzzed, and for a split second, hope flared in my chest. Maybe it was Jim calling to offer work. Maybe it was one of my old clients who'd heard what happened and wanted to help. Maybe it was even Paul calling to say he'd made a terrible mistake. It was a text from Chloe. Movers will be at the house Thursday to pack your belongings, only personal items, no furniture, no tools, no business equipment. Don't try to take anything that isn't clearly yours, even my tools. 40 years of collecting the best equipment money could buy. Tools that had built hundreds of homes and businesses across the county, and she was taking those too. I'd started with a basic hammer and a measuring tape when I was 20 years old, working day labor for $10 an hour. Every tool in my workshop represented a milestone, a successful job, a step up in the world. I typed back, "Those tools are mine. I bought them with my own money." Her response came back immediately. "Everything purchased during the marriage is community property. Check with your lawyer if you disagree." My lawyer, that was a joke. I'd called 3 different law firms that morning, and none of them would take my case without a substantial retainer. The cheapest quote I'd gotten was $15,000 up front, money I simply didn't have. Even if I did, Chloe had been planning this for months with expensive attorneys while I'd been obliviously swinging hammers and trusting my family. The walls of the motel room seemed to be closing in. I needed air, space to think. I walked outside into the parking lot where my pickup truck sat baking in the afternoon sun. At least they'd left me the truck. Probably because it was 12 years old and not worth much. Even then, I realized with a sinking feeling, I'd have to check whether the registration was in both our names. Across the street was a convenience store with a beer sign flickering in the window. For a moment, I considered buying a 6-pack, drinking away the pain and humiliation, but I'd seen too many men go down that road, watched good workers become unreliable drunks who couldn't hold a job. I wasn't going to give Chloe and Paul the satisfaction of destroying myself. Instead, I got in the truck and drove. No destination in mind, just the need to move, to feel like I had some control over something, even if it was just the direction I was heading. I ended up at the cemetery where my parents were buried. I hadn't visited in months, always too busy with work, with providing for a family that had been plotting against me. The headstones looked smaller than I remembered, weathered by 20 years of Texas storms. "I messed up, Dad," I said aloud, feeling foolish but needing to say the words. I trusted them, and they destroyed me. My father had been a simple man, a mechanic who'd worked at the same garage for 35 years until his heart gave out. He'd never had much, but he'd been respected in the community, known for his honesty and hard work. He'd been proud when I started my own business, prouder still when I married Chloe and gave him a grandson. "You always said family comes first," I continued, my voice cracking. "But what do you do when your family turns against you?" The wind rustled through the oak trees, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and distant rain. I stood there until the sun started to set, trying to figure out what came next. How a 60-year-old man rebuilds his life from nothing. When I finally got back to the motel, there was a message on my voicemail. My heart leaped, thinking maybe someone had heard about my situation and wanted to offer help or work. It was Paul. "Dad, I heard you're staying at that dump on Highway 47. That's embarrassing. You're making the whole family look bad. Maybe if you'd been a better businessman, a better husband, you wouldn't be in this situation. Don't expect any sympathy from us. You brought this on yourself." I listened to the message 3 times, each replay driving the knife deeper. This was my son, the boy I'd carried on my shoulders, whose baseball games I'd never missed, whose college tuition had cost me $73,000 that I'd gladly paid because I believed in him. As I lay down on the lumpy mattress that night, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of some foreign country, I realized something had shifted inside me. The shock was fading, replaced by something else. Not quite anger yet, but a cold, hard understanding. They thought they'd beaten me. They thought 60 years old meant finished, powerless, ready to just fade away quietly. They'd calculated everything perfectly, or so they believed. But they'd made one mistake. They'd underestimated the man who'd built something from nothing once before. And as I drifted off to sleep in that terrible motel room, a single thought crystallized in my mind. They had no idea what they'd just awakened. The storage unit smelled like dust and old cardboard. 40 years of memories crammed into a 10 by 10 space that cost me $68 a month I could barely afford. Chloe had been true to her word about letting me have my personal items, though her definition of personal was narrow enough to fit through a keyhole. I'd managed to salvage some clothes, a few photo albums she'd deemed worthless, and 3 boxes of paperwork from my home office that she'd apparently overlooked in her systematic looting. Now sitting on an overturned crate in the sweltering heat, I was going through those boxes for the 3rd time, hoping to find something, anything, that might help me understand how I'd ended up here. Most of it was routine stuff: old tax returns, expired insurance policies, warranty cards for appliances that now belong to someone else. But at the bottom of the 2nd box, underneath a stack of utility bills from 1998, my fingers found something I'd completely forgotten about: a manila envelope, yellowed with age, with my mother's careful handwriting across the front. "For Bobby, important papers, do not throw away." My hands shook as I opened it. Mom had died 8 years ago, and I'd been so busy with the business and dealing with her estate that I just grabbed this envelope along with a bunch of other documents and stuffed them in a box. I'd meant to go through everything carefully, but there had always been another job, another deadline, another crisis that needed my attention. Inside were documents I'd never seen before. A savings account opened in 1972 in my name, with my mother listed as custodian. The last statement, dated 6 months before she died, showed a balance of $87,412. I stared at the number, certain I was misreading it. $87,000. Money I'd never known existed sitting in an account I'd forgotten about, growing quietly for decades while I struggled to build my business and support my family. There was a handwritten note from my mother paper-clipped to the statement: "Bobby, I started this account when you turned 18 with the $500 your grandfather left you. I added to it whenever I could, even if it was just $20 or $30 from my grocery money. I wanted you to have something for emergencies, for when life gets hard. The bank has instructions to contact you if anything happens to me. Love, Mom." My throat tightened as I read her words. $500 from my grandfather, a man I barely remembered, had grown into nearly $90,000 because my mother had quietly sacrificed for decades, skipping lunches and buying generic groceries to add to my emergency fund, and I'd been too busy, too focused on everyone else's needs to even know it existed. The bank information was right there on the letterhead. First National Bank of Cedar Grove, about 40 miles from where I was sitting. I grabbed my phone and called the number, my heart pounding as it rang. "First National, this is Janet speaking." "Hi, Janet. My name is Robert Hendricks, and I think my mother might have opened an account for me there years ago. She passed away 8 years back, and I just found some paperwork." "Let me check our records, Mr. Hendricks. Can you give me your social security number and date of birth?" I rattled off the information, holding my breath while she typed. "Oh yes, here it is. Account number ending in 4729. I see we sent several letters to your address over the years regarding dormant account procedures, but we never heard back. Those letters had probably gotten lost in the chaos of mail that Chloe always handled, or maybe she'd intercepted them without telling me. Either way, it didn't matter now." "What's the current balance?" I asked, afraid to hope. "As of today, you have $91,863.47. Would you like to speak with someone about accessing the account?" $91,000, not a fortune, but enough to change everything. Enough to get me out of the Sunset Motel, enough to hire a decent lawyer, enough to start over with some dignity. I made an appointment for the next morning and spent the rest of the day in the storage unit, going through every scrap of paper with new eyes. If there was one account I'd forgotten about, maybe there were others. In the 3rd box, underneath a folder full of old medical bills, I found something else that made my heart race. Property tax statements for a piece of land I'd completely forgotten I owned. 12 acres outside of town that my uncle had left me 15 years ago. I'd paid the taxes faithfully every year, but never did anything with the land because it was too far from town to be useful for development. But according to these tax statements, the assessed value had been climbing steadily. What had been worth $22,000 in 2008 was now assessed at $137,000. The land was apparently in the path of the county's expansion, prime real estate for the suburban development boom that had been spreading outward from the city. I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. That evening, I drove out to take a look at the land. It sat on a hill overlooking a valley that was being rapidly filled with new subdivisions, a developer's dream, with highway access and city utilities already running along the road frontage. I could practically see the dollar signs. Back at the motel, I spread the documents across the little table by the window and did some quick math. The bank account plus the potential value of the land meant I had assets worth close to $230,000. Money that Chloe and Paul had no idea existed, accounts and property that predated my marriage and couldn't be touched by their lawyers. For the first time since that horrible birthday party, I allowed myself to smile. But as I organized the papers, another thought struck me. If I'd overlooked these assets, what else had I missed? What other mistakes had I made in trusting Chloe and Paul with my business and my life? I pulled out my laptop, the one thing I'd managed to grab before they changed the locks, and started researching. Property records were public information, And it didn't take long to find what I was looking for. The house I'd bought and paid for, the house they'd stolen from me through that power of attorney, had been listed for sale just 2 days after my birthday party. The asking price made my blood run cold. $450,000, nearly twice what I'd paid for it 23 years ago, and money that would go directly into Chloe and Paul's pockets while I lived in a $49 a night motel. But that wasn't the worst part. As I dug deeper into the public records, I found something that made my hands shake with rage. Paul had taken out a second mortgage on the house 6 months ago, borrowing $185,000 against the equity I'd built up over 2 decades, $185,000 that he'd apparently burned through in less than 6 months because the loan was already in default. The bank had filed preliminary foreclosure paperwork just last week. I sat back in the cheap motel chair, my mind racing. Paul had mortgaged my house without my knowledge, spent the money on God knows what, and then conspired with Chloe to kick me out before I could discover what they'd done. They weren't just greedy, they were desperate. The whole elaborate birthday party ambush had been their way of covering up Paul's financial disasters. That's when I realized something else. If Paul had defaulted on a $185,000 loan, and if he was truly running my business now, what kind of shape was the company in? I opened another browser window and started searching for Hendricks Construction. What I found made me sick to my stomach. 3 liens filed by suppliers in the past month. 2 lawsuits from clients claiming shoddy workmanship. A complaint filed with the Better Business Bureau alleging that the company had taken deposits for work that was never completed. My business, the company I'd built reputation by reputation over 4 decades, was being run into the ground by my own son. Paul had taken everything I'd worked for and was systematically destroying it, burning through client relationships and vendor trust that had taken me years to establish. I thought about all those afternoons he'd spent at job sites, talking to my crews, presenting himself as the new face of the company. He hadn't been learning the business. He'd been positioning himself to take over and cash out as quickly as possible, with no regard for the long-term consequences. As I sat there in that terrible motel room, surrounded by documents that told the story of my family's betrayal, I felt something shift inside me. The shock was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating anger. They thought they'd destroyed me, thought they'd reduced me to nothing more than a broken old man with no options. They had no idea I'd just found the tools I needed to fight back. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for Tom Bradley, a lawyer I'd known for 20 years. Tom handled real estate deals and business formations, not family law. But he was honest and smart, and more importantly, he knew me well enough to understand that I wasn't the kind of man who went down without a fight. Tom, it's Robert Hendricks. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me. If someone used a power of attorney to steal my business and my house, but I've just discovered assets they don't know about, what are my options? There was a long pause. Robert, I heard about what happened at your party. I'm sorry, man. That was brutal. I'm not looking for sympathy, Tom. I'm looking for strategy. Another pause, then Tom's voice took on a different tone, more focused, more professional. Meet me at my office tomorrow at 9. Bring everything you've got. If what you're telling me is true, we might have some options they haven't considered. As I hung up the phone, I looked around the shabby motel room one more time. Tomorrow, everything would change. Chloe and Paul thought they'd won, thought they'd reduced me to nothing. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. Tom Bradley's office hadn't changed much in the 20 years I'd known him. Same worn leather chairs, same law books lining the walls, same photo of his fishing boat on the desk. But the man sitting across from me had a different energy today. Sharp and focused as he spread my documents across his conference table. This is good, Robert. Really good, he said, adjusting his reading glasses as he studied the bank statements. The account predates your marriage by 15 years and the land inheritance is clearly separate property. Chloe's lawyers can't touch either one. I leaned forward, hardly daring to believe it. So I can access the money? Absolutely. In fact, I'd recommend you do it today before they figure out what you found. Tom picked up another document, frowning as he read. But this mortgage situation is troubling. Paul borrowed against your house without your knowledge. Used the power of attorney I gave them when I was sick. I never authorized any loans. Tom's frown deepened. That could be fraud, especially if he represented himself as having your explicit consent for the borrowing. The fact that he's already in default. He shook his head. They're in serious trouble, Robert. Much more serious than they probably realize. We spent the next 2 hours going through everything I'd found. Tom made phone calls, pulled up public records on his computer, cross-referenced dates and documents. With each discovery, his expression grew grimmer. Your son has been busy, he said finally. Besides the mortgage default, he's got 3 outstanding judgments against the business, 2 tax liens, and what looks like a pattern of taking client deposits without completing work. The state licensing board has opened an investigation. My stomach clenched. How bad is it? Bad enough that the business is probably beyond saving. He's destroyed relationships it took you decades to build, burned bridges with every major supplier in the county. Tom leaned back in his chair. But here's the interesting part. Legally, you're still listed as the primary owner of the business license. Paul has signing authority through the power of attorney, but he never actually transferred ownership. I felt a spark of something that might have been hope. What does that mean? It means you still have options. You could revoke the power of attorney, resume control of the business, fire Paul as an employee. Tom's smile was grim. Of course, you'd also be inheriting all the debts and legal problems he's created. Or you could let the business fail completely, declare bankruptcy if necessary, and start fresh with your newly discovered assets. Clean slate, no encumbrances. I thought about that. 40 years of building Hendricks Construction, gone. All those satisfied customers. All those successful projects reduced to nothing because my son had no respect for what I'd built. I need to see for myself what's happening, I said. Can you get me access to the business records? Bank statements, vendor accounts, client files? Tom nodded. I'll draft a letter asserting your ownership rights and demanding full financial disclosure. They'll have to comply or risk criminal charges for fraud. That afternoon, I drove to the bank where my mother's account waited. The process was surprisingly simple. A few signatures, some identity verification, and suddenly I had a cashier's check for $91,863.47 in my pocket. I opened a new account at a different bank, one where Chloe had never set foot. For the first time in weeks, I had financial breathing room, but I wasn't ready to confront Chloe and Paul yet. First, I needed to understand exactly what they'd done, how deep the damage went. I needed information, and I knew where to get it. Jim Patterson had been my foreman for 12 years before I'd promoted him to project supervisor. He'd been at my birthday party, had seen the whole ugly scene, and unlike some of my other employees, he'd called the next day to check on me. If anyone knew what was really happening with the business, it would be Jim. I found him at Murphy's Bar, the same place we'd been meeting for beers after work for over a decade. He looked up as I walked in, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Robert, hell man, I've been worried about you. Heard you were staying at that motel out on 47. Not anymore," I said, sliding into the booth across from him. "But I need to ask you some questions about what's been going on with the company." Jim's expression darkened. "It's bad, Robert, real bad. Your boy's been making decisions that make no sense, taking jobs we can't handle, promising completion dates that are impossible. Tell me everything." Over the next 2 hours, Jim painted a picture of systematic destruction that made my blood boil. Paul had fired 3 of my most experienced crew members, claiming they were too expensive. He'd taken on a shopping center renovation that required permits and expertise we didn't have, promising the client completion in 6 weeks when it should have taken 16. He'd bought cheap materials from unvetted suppliers, materials that had failed inspection and had to be replaced at our expense. The Morrison job, Jim said, referring to a luxury home renovation we'd started in July. Paul promised them custom millwork that would cost us $37,000 to subcontract, but he only bid $18,000 for the whole job. When I tried to explain the math to him, he told me I was too old to understand modern business practices. What happened to the Morrison contract? They fired us last week, demanded their deposit back, which Paul had already spent. They're talking about suing for damages. Jim took a long pull from his beer. "Robert, there ain't a supplier in the county who'll extend us credit anymore. Paul's been paying bills late, disputing legitimate charges, making enemies everywhere." I felt sick. Each story was another nail in the coffin of everything I'd built. "How many jobs are we behind on?" 7 active contracts, all of them problem jobs. 3 clients have already retained lawyers. Jim leaned forward, lowering his voice. "And Robert, there's something else. Paul's been telling people that you were stealing from the company, that he had to take over to save the business from your mismanagement." The betrayal cut deeper than anything else. Not only was Paul destroying my life's work, he was rewriting history to make me the villain. "The crew doesn't believe it," Jim added quickly. "They know you better than that. But some of the clients, some of the suppliers, they're starting to wonder." I thanked Jim and left the bar with my head spinning. The damage was worse than I'd imagined, but it also gave me leverage I hadn't expected. If Paul was telling people I'd been stealing, if he was claiming he'd saved the business from my mismanagement, then he'd made a critical error. He'd opened himself up to defamation charges while simultaneously admitting he'd been running the company into the ground under his own leadership. The next morning, I got a call from Tom Bradley. "I've got news, and it's not all good. Paul's lawyer responded to my demand for financial records. They're claiming you abandoned the business voluntarily and have no right to access the files." "Can they do that?" They can try, but they're on shaky legal ground. However, there's something else. I did some digging into that second mortgage Paul took out. The loan application lists his income as $250,000 annually from the construction business. I nearly choked. $250,000? The business has never generated that kind of profit. Our best year, I took home maybe $80,000. That's what I thought, which means Paul either committed fraud on the loan application or he's been skimming money from the business accounts. Either way, it's a felony. The pieces were starting to fit together. Paul hadn't just been incompetent. He'd been actively looting the company, falsifying records, and using the stolen money to qualify for loans he could never repay. The birthday party ambush hadn't been just about greed. It had been about covering up his crimes. Tom, I want you to file a complaint with the district attorney's office. Fraud, embezzlement, whatever charges fit. And I want a full forensic audit of the business accounts going back 2 years. That's going to be expensive, Robert. Are you sure you want to go down this road? I thought about my 40 years of honest work, about the reputation Paul was destroying, about the clients and suppliers he was cheating. I thought about my mother's sacrifice, putting away $20 and $30 at a time so I'd have something to fall back on when life got hard. I'm sure. Use whatever money it takes from my mother's account. She'd want me to fight for what's right. That evening, I sat in my new apartment, nothing fancy but clean and respectable, and made a list of everyone I needed to contact. Clients who'd been cheated, suppliers who'd been stiffed, employees who'd been unfairly fired, people who deserved to know the truth about what Paul had done. I wasn't ready to confront Chloe and Paul directly yet. They still thought I was a broken old man living in a motel, defeated and powerless. Let them keep thinking that while I gathered evidence, while I built my case, while I prepared to show them exactly what happened when you stole from the wrong man. My phone rang, interrupting my planning. Unknown number, but I answered anyway. Robert, it's Margaret Morrison. Jim gave me your number. The Morrison job. The luxury renovation Paul had botched so badly they'd fired us and demanded their deposit back. Mrs. Morrison, I heard about the problems with your project. I'm sorry. That's why I'm calling. Your son told us you were no longer involved with the business, but frankly, we'd rather work with you. We know your reputation. Is there any chance you might be willing to finish our renovation as an independent contractor? I looked around my modest apartment, at the documents spread across my table, at the evidence of Paul's destruction of everything I'd built. A slow smile spread across my face. Mrs. Morrison, I think we can work something out. It was time to start fighting back. The first call came at 6:17 on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after I'd started working the Morrison renovation. I was already on the job site, measuring trim work in what would be their new master suite, when my phone started buzzing. Paul, I let it go to voicemail. The second call came 12 minutes later, then a third. By 7:30, my phone had rung 8 times, all from Paul. I finally answered on the 9th call, more out of curiosity than any desire to talk to him. Dad, his voice was tight, strained in a way I'd never heard before. We need to talk. I'm working, I said, running my hand along the crown molding I'd just installed. Perfect fit, smooth finish. The kind of craftsmanship that had built my reputation over 4 decades. Working where? Doing what? I heard you were doing some kind of handyman work for the Morrisons. I could hear the panic underneath his attempt at casual conversation. That's right. Dad, you can't do that. You signed a non-compete agreement when you transferred the business. You're violating our contract. I almost laughed. What non-compete agreement? I never signed anything like that. It was in the power of attorney paperwork. Page 7, Section 4. You agreed not to work in construction within the county for 2 years. Now I did laugh, a sound with no humor in it. Paul, I've had lawyers go through every document I signed. There's no non-compete clause anywhere. You want to know why? Because I never transferred the business to you. I'm still the legal owner. Silence. Then, that's impossible, is it? Check with your lawyer. Better yet, check with the state licensing board. They'll tell you who holds the contractor's license for Hendricks Construction. I could hear him breathing, fast and shallow. Dad, listen to me. You need to stop whatever you're doing. You're going to destroy everything. I'm not the one who destroyed everything, son. Another long pause. When he spoke again, his voice was different, smaller. The business is in trouble. We need to work together to fix it. I made some mistakes, I admit that, but we can turn it around if we work together. I set down my measuring tape and walked to the window, looking out at the Morrisons' backyard where Mrs. Morrison was tending to her rose garden. She'd told me yesterday how relieved she was to have me on the job, how much better she slept knowing the work would be done right. What kind of mistakes, Paul? Cash flow problems, some client disputes. Nothing we can't handle if we pool our resources. Resources, that's what I was to him. Not his father, not a partner, just resources to be exploited. How much do you owe, Paul? It's complicated. There are some outstanding invoices, some vendor payments that are behind schedule. How much? A longer pause. Around 300,000, maybe a little more. $300,000. My chest tightened as the full scope of his destruction hit me. In less than 2 years, he'd taken a business that was debt-free and profitable and driven it $300,000 into the hole. Dad, are you there? I'm here. So you'll help? We can meet this afternoon and figure out a payment plan with the creditors. Maybe take out a loan against your land. He knew about the land. Somehow he'd discovered the 12 acres I'd inherited from my uncle, my last remaining asset, and he already had plans for it. No. What do you mean, no? I mean, I'm not throwing good money after bad. I'm not funding your mistakes. His voice changed again. Harder now, more like the cruel young man who'd humiliated me at my birthday party. You don't have a choice, old man. You're still legally responsible for the business debts. If Hendricks Construction goes bankrupt, they'll come after everything you own. Will they? Of course they will. You think you can just walk away? Think again. I smiled, something I'd been doing more often lately. Paul, you might want to check those legal documents again. I never transferred ownership of the business to you. I gave you signing authority through a power of attorney, but I'm still the owner of record, which means I can revoke that authority anytime I want. You can't do that. I already did. Tom Bradley filed the paperwork yesterday morning. The silence stretched so long I thought he might have hung up. Then I heard him talking to someone else, his voice muffled like he'd covered the phone. When he came back, he sounded desperate. Dad, please, don't do this. We can work it out. We're family. Are we? Because at my birthday party, you made it pretty clear what you thought of family. I was angry. I said things I didn't mean. You called me a failure, a washed-up old man. You laughed when you handed me those eviction papers. I was protecting the family assets. Chloe said it was the only way to save the business. Chloe, of course she was behind the legal maneuvering, but hearing Paul blame his cruelty on her made something cold settle in my chest. Is Chloe there with you now? Another pause. She's concerned about the situation. I could picture them, huddled together in what used to be my kitchen, frantically trying to figure out how to fix the disaster they'd created, the house they'd stolen from me, the house they'd probably been planning to sell to pay off Paul's debts. Put her on the phone. Dad, I don't think that's a good idea. Put her on the phone, Paul. I heard muffled conversation, then Chloe's voice, trying to sound calm and reasonable. Robert, we need to discuss this like adults. Like adults? You mean the way we discussed it at my birthday party? That was Paul's idea. I told him it was too harsh, but he insisted it was necessary to protect the business. Lies. All lies. But I let her continue. The important thing now is to work together to resolve this financial situation. We can't let pride interfere with practical solutions. You're right, I said. Pride shouldn't interfere with practical solutions. I could hear the relief in her voice. Exactly. So we'll meet this afternoon and work out a plan. No, Chloe, you misunderstood me. I'm not going to let my pride interfere with the practical solution of letting you and Paul face the consequences of your choices. Robert, be reasonable. I am being reasonable. You wanted me out of your lives. Congratulations, you got what you wanted. I hung up. The calls kept coming throughout the day. Paul, Chloe, Paul again. I ignored them all and focused on my work. By evening, I had 17 missed calls and 12 voicemails I didn't bother listening to. The next morning, I got a call from Tom Bradley. Robert, I've got news. The forensic accountant finished her preliminary review of the business records. It's worse than we thought. How much worse? Paul's been systematically looting the business for over 18 months. False invoices, padded expense reports, cash withdrawals with no documentation. The conservative estimate is that he's stolen over $400,000. $400,000. My legs felt weak and I had to sit down. But here's the interesting part. Tom continued. Most of that money didn't go to business expenses or even personal luxuries. He's been gambling, Robert. Online poker, sports betting, casino trips to Louisiana. The man has a serious addiction. Gambling. That explained the desperate borrowing, the risky business decisions, the complete disregard for long-term consequences. Paul hadn't just been incompetent. He'd been feeding an addiction that consumed everything I'd built. What are our options? Criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud, civil recovery for the stolen funds, and since you've revoked the power of attorney, you can shut down the business completely, terminate all contracts, and walk away from the debts he created. What about the employees? Jim and the guys who've been loyal to me? You could hire them for your new business. Start fresh, clean slate. Let Paul and Chloe deal with the creditors. That afternoon, I called a meeting with Jim and the 3 crew members who'd stayed loyal despite Paul's mismanagement. We met at Murphy's Bar, the same place where I'd learned the truth about what Paul had been doing. Boys, I'm starting a new company. Hendricks Construction is done, but I'm forming Hendricks Renovations. Same quality work, same standards, but without the baggage. Jim grinned. When do we start? Monday morning. Jim, you'll be my partner. 20% ownership. The rest of you get a raise and profit sharing. They were all smiles and handshakes until my phone started ringing again. Paul calling for what must have been the 30th time that day. This time I answered, "Dad, thank God. We've been trying to reach you all day. I've been busy. We need to meet. Tonight. It's urgent." Something in his voice was different. Not angry, not demanding. Broken. Why? The creditors are demanding immediate payment. If we don't come up with $200,000 by Friday, they're going to file criminal charges for fraudulent business practices. Criminal charges. The reality was finally hitting them. And you want me to save you. We're desperate, Dad. The house is going into foreclosure. Chloe's credit cards are maxed out. We have nothing left. I looked around the bar at the men who'd stood by me, who'd believed in the quality and integrity I'd spent 40 years building. Then I thought about the Morrison job, nearly complete now, with Mrs. Morrison so pleased she'd already recommended me to 3 of her neighbors. "Paul, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I'm listening. When you handed me those papers at my birthday party, when you called me a failure and a washed-up old man, when you laughed at my humiliation in front of all those people, what did you think would happen? Dad, I was wrong. I admit that, but we can fix this." "No, Paul, we can't fix this, because there is no we anymore. You made that clear 3 weeks ago." I could hear him crying now, actually crying. "Please, Dad, I'm begging you. We'll lose everything. You already lost everything. The day you decided to betray me was the day you lost the only person who would have helped you through anything." I hung up and turned off my phone. Jim raised his beer. "To fresh starts," he said. "To fresh starts," I agreed. Outside, the Texas sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. Tomorrow, I'd go back to the Morrison job, finish the trim work in their master suite, collect my payment, and move on to the next project. Chloe and Paul would face their creditors alone. Their house would go into foreclosure, their stolen empire would crumble, and I would sleep better than I had in years. 6 months later, I stood in my new office, looking out the window at the Hendricks renovation sign that Jim had installed that morning. Clean white letters on a dark blue background, professional but not flashy. Everything the old business should have been. The phone on my desk had been ringing steadily all morning. 3 new clients wanting estimates, 2 suppliers confirming delivery schedules, and 1 call from a reporter at the county newspaper wanting to do a story about the comeback of Robert Hendricks. I'd politely declined the interview. Some victories didn't need to be announced. The Morrison job had led to 3 more high-end renovations. Word traveled fast in the wealthy neighborhoods on the north side of town, especially when the work was done right, on time, and on budget. My new business was already booked solid through the end of the year. Jim knocked on my doorframe. "Robert, you got a minute? What's up?" He held up a check, grinning. "Final payment from the Henderson kitchen remodel, $12,000 plus a $500 bonus because we finished early." I took the check, feeling the familiar satisfaction of a job well done and fairly paid for. "How's the crew handling the Thompson project?" "Smooth as silk. Martinez has got those custom cabinets fitting like they were built for that space specifically." Jim's grin widened, which they were, thanks to your measurements. It was the small things that mattered. Precise measurements, quality materials, honest communication with clients. The fundamentals I'd built my reputation on before Paul had nearly destroyed it all. "Any word from the old creditors?" Jim asked, his tone carefully neutral. I shook my head. Tom Bradley had fielded a few calls from lawyers representing various companies that Paul had stiffed, but they'd quickly realized that going after me personally would be expensive and ultimately fruitless. I documented everything, proved that Paul had acted without my knowledge or consent in the financial decisions that destroyed the business. What about Paul and Chloe? That was the question I'd been expecting. In a county this size, it was impossible to completely avoid news about people you'd once been close to, especially when their downfall was as spectacular as theirs had been. "Haven't heard from them directly," I said, "but Sarah Collins mentioned she saw Chloe working at the diner on Highway 19. Jim nodded. Sarah was one of our regular suppliers, and gossip traveled fast in the small business community. The news about Chloe working as a waitress at a truck stop diner wasn't exactly surprising, but it still felt surreal. The woman who'd once spent $300 on a single shopping trip at the mall, who'd complained when I suggested we eat at chain restaurants instead of the expensive places downtown, now serving coffee and burgers to truckers and construction workers. And Paul? Last I heard, he was doing day labor for Martinez Construction, when he can get it. That stung more than I'd expected. Martinez Construction was my biggest competitor, but Miguel Martinez was a good man who ran an honest business. If he'd hired Paul for day labor, it meant Paul was willing to work, willing to start at the bottom and earn his way back up. Part of me, the part that remembered teaching a 7-year-old boy how to use a level, wanted to believe that maybe Paul had learned something from his spectacular failure. But the larger part, the part that still heard his voice calling me a failure, a washed-up old man, wasn't ready for forgiveness yet. Maybe never would be. My phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number, but I recognized the area code. Local. Dad, this is Paul. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted you to know that I'm getting help. I've been going to Gamblers Anonymous for 3 months now. I know I can't fix what I did, but I'm trying to understand why I did it. I'm sorry for everything. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I finally understand what I threw away. I read the message twice, then set the phone down without responding. Words were easy. Paul had always been good with words, good at saying what people wanted to hear. It was actions that mattered, and his actions had spoken louder than any apology ever could. Everything okay? Jim asked, noticing my expression. Just business, I said, which wasn't exactly a lie. That afternoon, I drove out to my 12 acres to meet with the developer who'd expressed interest in buying the land. The price he'd quoted was enough to make me financially secure for the rest of my life, enough to expand Hendricks Renovations into the kind of operation I'd always dreamed of running. As I walked the property line, I thought about my mother. About the money she'd saved $20 and $30 at a time because she believed I might need it someday. She'd been right, of course. I had needed it, not for the emergency she'd probably imagined, but for the chance to rebuild my life when the people I'd trusted most had tried to destroy it. The developer, a sharp-dressed man named Williams from the city, pulled up in a BMW and walked over to where I was standing. Beautiful piece of land, Mr. Hendricks. Perfect for the kind of upscale development our company specializes in. We walked the property together, discussing access roads and utility connections, zoning requirements, and environmental considerations. Professional conversation between two businessmen who understood the value of what we were discussing. I'm prepared to offer $400,000 for the entire 12 acres, William said finally. Cash deal, close in 30 days, $400,000. Combined with my mother's savings and the steady income from my new business, it would mean true financial independence. Never again would I have to depend on anyone else. Never again would I have to trust someone else with my security. I'll consider your offer, I told him, though I'd already made my decision. That evening, I sat on the porch of my apartment, watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar shades of gold and red. My phone had been silent all afternoon. No more messages from Paul, no desperate calls from Chloe. The crisis that had driven them to reach out to me had apparently passed, or maybe they'd finally accepted that I wasn't going to save them. Either way was fine with me. A knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment I wondered if Paul had decided to show up in person. But when I opened the door, I found Margaret Morrison standing there with a bottle of wine and a warm smile. I hope you don't mind me dropping by unannounced, she said. I wanted to thank you again for the beautiful work you did on our house. Margaret was a widow, probably close to my age, whose husband had died 2 years earlier, leaving her with a house that needed extensive renovation. We'd gotten to know each other during the month I'd spent working on her project, sharing coffee breaks and conversations about everything from construction techniques to the challenges of starting over in your 60s. Not at all, I said, stepping aside to let her in. Would you like to see the sunset from the porch? We sat on my small porch, sharing the wine and watching the sky darken. Margaret told me about her garden, about the book club she'd joined, about the volunteer work she was doing at the animal shelter. Simple pleasures, the kind of contentment that came from building a life based on genuine connections rather than obligations and manipulation. Can I ask you something personal? She said after a comfortable silence. Sure. Do you ever regret it? Walking away from your family the way you did? I considered the question, watching a hawk circle lazily in the distance. There's a difference between walking away and being pushed out, I said finally. They made their choice long before I made mine, but they're your family. Family is supposed to be the people who support you, who have your back when things get tough. What I had wasn't family. It was people who used me and discarded me when I was no longer useful. Margaret nodded slowly. My sister went through something similar with her son. Different circumstances, but the same feeling of betrayal. She struggled with guilt for years, wondering if she should have tried harder to maintain the relationship. And what did she decide? That some relationships aren't worth saving. That you can love someone and still refuse to let them destroy you. We sat in comfortable silence as the first stars appeared. Margaret's presence was calming in a way I hadn't experienced in years. No agenda, no demands, no expectations beyond simple human companionship. I should probably head home, she said eventually. But I wanted you to know that if you ever need anything, a friend to talk to or just someone to share a sunset with, I'm only a phone call away. After she left, I sat on the porch for another hour, thinking about second chances and new beginnings. At 60 years old, I'd learned that it was never too late to start over. Never too late to build something better than what you'd lost. My phone buzzed once more. Another text, this time from Chloe. Robert, I know we hurt you badly, and I know we don't deserve forgiveness, but I want you to know that I understand now what we threw away. You were a good man, and we treated you terribly. I'm sorry. I read the message, then deleted it without responding. Some apologies came too late, when the damage was too complete to repair. I'd learned to live without their approval, without their presence in my life, and I'd discovered that I was better off without them. Tomorrow I'd call Williams and accept his offer for the land. I'd use the money to expand Hendrik's renovations, maybe buy a building instead of renting office space, maybe hire another crew so we could take on bigger projects. I'd build something new, something better, something that couldn't be stolen or destroyed by people who didn't understand its value. The hawk was still circling overhead, riding the evening thermals with effortless grace, independent, self-sufficient, answerable to no one. I understood how it felt.